So, thank you very much for this impressive talk. I thought, given the number of slides, that you will never make it in 40 minutes, but this was great. I only have a couple of questions, and then I would open up for general discussion. The first one is a very, very basic question. In all countries you are studying, the level of, as I call it, educational poverty is very high. So you have a very high percentage of people who are at the lowest level of competencies. Like in Germany, we have 24% of all 15 years old male kids who are functional analphabets. This is a term the PISA consortium uses. So the level of absolute poverty in education is high. We also have many people with no educational certificate at all. And you know, looking over Europe, that Germany is not an exception to this. At the other hand, we know that education becomes more and more important for getting jobs. So my question, my most basic question indeed is whether we should be concerned, whether we should be concerned about decreasing inequality, or whether we should be first and much more concerned about decreasing educational poverty. So when you decrease educational poverty, you really do something for everybody. You know, some use then this frame of an elevator. So you talk about absolute mobility. Everybody goes up. And you decrease the number of people who do not have adequate education, measured in terms of competencies or in years of schooling or certificates. It doesn't matter. So I think that this is extremely helpful for those people, getting them out of educational poverty, although you do not decrease inequality at all. During all those years I was dealing with educational expansion and things like this, I was indeed primarily interested, as you are, in decreasing educational inequality, and I changed my mind because I think that decreasing educational inequality does not mean to help those kids who need our help most. So this is my first very general and basic point. The second point is about your decomposition of educational attainment. So you are talking about competencies and you are talking about years of schooling. When you talk about competencies, you are talking about cognitive competencies only, because this is what PISA is measuring. When we talk about years of schooling, I think that you are adding up years in general school with years in like our dual apprenticeship system. Those two things are not the same. And in Germany, we all know that it is not cognitive competencies and it's not years in schooling, but indeed it is the certificate which matters. So this is a third measure of educational attainment. I know that this is not only Germany where actually the certificate matters and the degree which you have in your final certificate. So I wonder whether this decomposition which you used is a right one, given that we have to deal with so many different educational systems. I also wonder whether I think that what we really need most is to have a measure for educational attainment which does not only measure cognitive competencies. So it's highly needed to look at social competencies, to look at emotional competencies as well, and we do not have those measures readily at hand. We have small samples where we also have those measures. But this seems to me the most important point. And then I think that if you look at certificates or at years in schooling, you probably capture much better social competencies and then this is your quality measure, because it captures social competencies and something like cognitive competencies, while your competence measure only captures cognitive competencies. So I'm not really following your decomposition in saying this is my quantitative measure and this is my qualitative measure. The third point is when you showed us those graphs where you correlate the quality of education or the quantity of education with inequality of income, the correlation was not very high. So it was a very noisy picture. It was a very foggy correlation. So I wonder whether we should introduce the welfare state, the system a welfare state is set up because different types of welfare states also have different types of educational systems. So I think looking at the composition of a welfare state is a very relevant intervening variable we should look at. Another sort of basic point which adds to your empirical analysis is that I very much wonder about the level of analysis you are choosing. You are looking at countries. Like in Germany, looking at a country is irritating in a way, because we have 16 different educational systems, and they are very different indeed. And Germany is not the only federal country, so you have many countries in Europe which have a federal educational system. So I wonder what really happens if you add all those different, at least I know Germany, of course, very best. If you add all those 16 different educational systems to one system, I wonder what kind of distortion you get into your text. And I should probably only add two more points. The one is on how you measure reforms, and you distinguish between closing reforms and opening reforms. In Germany, we have one reform after the other. I mean, we have tons of reforms. One reform follows the other reform. And in the moment our government changes, we have another reform. And you have always to multiply this by 16 because we have those 16 systems. Overall, you also see in Germany an educational expansion, but it does not really matter as much whether or not you have a reform and whether you label it inclusive or exclusive. What matters most is how this reform really works. And I give you one example. We opened up the number of possibilities for getting to the gymnasium. In a German state 1, you open it up by giving parents the choice. So the parents can decide whether the children move up to a gymnasium. In another country, you say, well, this is a teacher's choice. So the teacher can decide whether or not a child goes up to a gymnasium. So in both ways, you open it because you increase the number of people who are allowed to get to a gymnasium. But in one case, when you give parents the vote, then you increase inequality considerably. While if you give teachers the vote, you decrease inequality, interestingly enough. So I wonder whether reforms by such is not a concept which is too general, and whether or not you should not look at a more disaggregated way at your reforms, which otherwise I really like a lot. And I think that those types of educational research is indeed highly needed. I have one sort of small question, but it is not really small because it's very important. And I indeed wondered about your slide 24, where you said this pre-primary. You looked at the effect of pre-primary education, and you said, well, this is less effective. But at the beginning of your talk, and in line with all empirical research, which I know, pre-primary education has the most effect on closing the gap between kids coming from well-educated parents and those kids coming from socially disadvantaged parents. So I wonder how you explain this small effect here, and I should probably close here. I have a couple of other questions, but they are mostly tiny questions. And now I think that you give a short answer and then we open it up to the audience. Is this correct? Yes. May I sit down there as well?
If I may follow, thank you for very interesting comments. I will follow the reverse order. Let me start with the issue of pre-primary. You're perfectly right. The reason why I say it's less effective because one of the two coefficients is not statistically significant, the one on inequality. The reason is that we don't have the right measure of pre-primary activity. The right measure of pre-primary reform should be something like how many kids or how many places or how many pre-primary schools are available to the population. While on the contrary, the only measure we have is whether a government at the central level is or not putting some years of pre-primary education on the compulsory side. So the reason is that we are not measuring what we would like to measure.
Okay. Then you have to be careful because those results are taken seriously.
No, I know, but
in particular if they come from you.
They say that you also need to speak in the... Again, about the data. Unfortunately, we are working on data which are not appropriate. Why? Because if I want to claim that the income inequality is created by quality and quantity, the ideal data set would be that I test an individual at the exit of the school system in terms of years of education completed and also in terms of capabilities. And then I keep track of this individual over several years, and then once he or she is 40, 50s, then I check the inequality in incomes achieved by these people over the relevant age cohort. On the contrary, we don't have this type of data set, at least not in Europe. There is only UK who got a longitudinal data set testing the student at different age. They did this great project, which is the National Child Development Survey. All the British people born in the last week of March 1958, and these people have been tested every 5 years. So we have a test measure at the age of 5, test measure at the age of 10, and so on. This is the ideal data set. In our oh, it went off. In the graph that Professor Menninger was correctly pointing out is very noisy. The reason is that is an experiment. We take the first student survey on mathematics conducted in 1964, only on 7 European countries. These people were born in 1955. Then we go to the same countries, we take a representative sample of the population aged born in the same years, and we pretend that even if these are not the same individual, the inequality in competencies of the young population in 1964 may be relevant for the inequality in incomes. You do understand it's a very heroic assumption, but it's the only way in which we try to correlate competencies of the students and labor market income. There are data sets where you have the competencies in the adult population. There are now 3 or 4 data sets where you test in a very simple way. For example, you may test the cognitive ability of an individual, an adult getting older, like my age, for example, asking me to provide name of animals starting with A. And you give me an amount of time, let's say a minute, and the more I can count, the better is my cognitive ability. Or you may ask me to make calculation by heart, and these measures prove that there is a decline in competencies due to age. And the decline rate is correlated with educational ability. So if I check the distribution of competencies in the adult population, this is affected by education, by labor market experience, by age, and therefore it's difficult to claim that this is due to schooling, just because these populations have different age, different labor market experience. You correctly say that we should use a different notion of competencies. I totally agree. There are some attempts to use other competencies, like, for example, self-consciousness or self-confidence or control, but these measures become a realm of psychologists and not anymore of economists. I'm already somehow getting close to sociology and other disciplines, but I would never dare to provide measure of something which is untouchable for my discipline. Then another good point is we speak of country while there are federal states. That is absolutely true. The point is that once we go to the data set of our dependent variable, incomes or educational attainment or even competencies, these data are not disaggregated by lender, for example. I don't know whether this is for secrecy or for other reason. For example, in the Italian data or the Spanish data on PISA, they are divided by region or by states. The German one are not given this kind of disaggregation. I've been investigating with the OECD headquarters to Andrew Schleifer, asking him, would you mind to provide me the codes of the region where these students are located? And he say, absolutely not. I mean, I would like to go to a more disaggregated level of analysis, but in all the data set I've been working with, I couldn't find this kind of disaggregation. But it's definitely true that my measure of reform is what is collected at the federal level by the EURIDICE, which is this agency of the European Union, and I'm really convinced that it's not appropriate. For example, in the case of Belgium, they do provide information about Flemish Belgium and French-speaking Belgium, and I do consider them as 2 states. I'm very happy if I can disaggregate my data set because I increase the number of points of observation. About the direction of the reforms, your example is perfect. You may formally increase by giving more freedom to people to go to gymnasium, but according to the way in which you do, you may go in direction or in the other one. If you push the argument even farther, then we cannot do cross-country analysis, because any country is so specific in terms of institutional design that it's impossible to come out with a general message. Here is a trade-off. The more detailed is the analysis, the better it is for the appropriateness of the policy description, but then you do not exploit the cross-country variation. On the point of certification, I'm aware of that. One of my discussants was a German guy. He made exactly the same point. I know that in different countries, let's say, the social meaning of the education and attainment is different, because it's not only a problem of certificates. In some countries, it's also a problem of social status and so on. Using the meter of the time spent in school is a meter where in the night all the cows are black. I'm perfectly aware of that, but otherwise I don't find any other meter on which, in the robustness check of our analysis, we have been using population shares completing secondary or population share completing tertiary education as additional measure of educational attainment. But again, secondary completion is has different meaning in different countries, because in some countries they are counting lower secondary, in some other upper secondary. Some countries secondary school end at the age of 17, in some other end at the age of 19. So the other viable solutions are not better than the one we have adopted. About the point of poverty, this is a comment that I like more. I perfectly agree, and myself, I've been conducting the following exercise on Italian data. I discovered that the Kingdom of Italy introduced compulsory education in 1856, just by stating that everyone should go to school, 8 years of schools. Simply, they didn't build schools. And people kept on not going to school just because there were no schools. And they started building schools 1 century later. So we are working on bills, on law, not on the application of the law. And when I discovered this, I proposed a measure of educational poverty, as you suggested, as the deviation of your educational attainment from the median achievement of the population. So you are poor in terms of education, like in incomes. You are poor if you are below half of the median achievement of the population. And using that measure, it comes out that effectively these measures move in a different direction compared to inequality. So I perfectly agree with this comment. The point is, if we want to work against the poverty in education compared to the inequality in education, we should work on the adult population, not on the young one. Because at the aggregate level, the poor are typically retired people or people close to retirement, at least in all the Mediterranean area, because these are poor because they didn't went to school 40 or 50 years ago. And designing policies to bring adult population into school again is not that easy, because the kind of incentives you may provide are rather weak. We had an experiment in my country in the 70s, because by that time the industrialization required people with more educational attainment, and all these migrants from the south of the country to the north, they basically didn't have any education. And so they create a course, special courses, which brought 2 million people to get a lower secondary degree, which were designed at the end of the working day in a way such that the enterprise was paying for 1 hour and a half, and they were putting another hour and a half. So they got 3 hours of schooling every day for the entire year. This was providing good incentive, because people who wanted to leave the workplace were happy to go to school if they didn't have the degree. Even if they had to spend an additional hour and a half, they got basically an extra time from work. So combining this was rather expensive for the employer, but at the same time it was beneficial for them because they were improving the quality of their labor force. The government was putting additional resources because they hired new teachers who were supposedly expert in adult education. And, they changed the education and attainment and very likely the competencies of 2 million people in a time period over 5 years. So it was a mass phenomenon. I don't know whether you can replicate such an exercise or such a policy, for example, for raising the education and attainment to the secondary level in modern economies with limited resources to be invested in education.
May I respond? I only want to respond to one point. It is an entire misunderstanding to the last point or the first point which I made. I'm not talking about old people. I'm really talking about many, many, many young people in a rich country like in Germany who are below an absolute level of education they should receive. And I pointed this out with this high number of people, of young people at the age of 15, which are below the lowest level of cognitive competencies. And the PISA consortium calls those people functional analphabets. So I really think that it's high time to start in particular with this group. This is not to say that we don't need further education and that we don't need other measures, to increase educational attainment of older people. Of course we do need that. But we should really start at the very beginning, and we don't do that. And therefore, over the years I come to accept educational inequality as long as we do something to decrease educational poverty, which seems to be very important to me, and I do not only relate to relative measures like you did, but I also mean absolute levels of poverty in education, which we still have. And I should probably add one more thing, and this is a very positive thing. We just created yesterday a starting point for a new big data source, and it's called the National Educational Panel Study, where you have exactly what you have in Great Britain. So you have measurements of cognitive competencies, of social competencies, of certificates over an entire lifespan, starting with pregnant mothers until the age of 76. So we look at different cohorts, and many of those data, this has been our project for the last 5 years. This project is transferred, or will be in a short time be transferred in a new Leibniz Institute, and you have access to some of those data already. Of course, the quality of those data is getting better and better the longer the survey runs, but given that we already are in our field since 5 years, they are very good data already. So now, should I now ask for, so are there further questions too?
I have also the European experience, but I've been teaching at an American state university for the last 50 years, and I also can see how these educational policies developed. I see them rather as pessimistically. And I also don't believe that so-called left-wing governments are more inclusive. I think the Obama government I wouldn't call a left-wing government, or I wouldn't even call it a right-wing government and so forth. But the educational policies go exactly in the wrong direction. More and more private schools, less money for public schools, but all the others religious, other private schools, especially high school, flourish because there are people who are able, because it's expensive to attend these other private schools, and even the prime ministers of the other different states, like my prime minister, there is a new bill, less money to public schools and tax vouchers to all parents with money who have to pay the education of their children in other private schools and so forth. As I see a tremendous move in this direction, and I also heard that private schools are doing quite well here, in this country, more and more. I don't share the optimism that in the long run, I don't see the long run at the moment and so forth. It's also very difficult to include people from minority. The university I'm teaching is one of the most liberal university. We gave lots of monies to black students because there were no black students. And I'm in Wisconsin, close to Milwaukee, in Chicago, where millions of blacks live. We didn't have black students, and we gave money to the black students for 4 years, stipends. They didn't study. They was sitting in the restaurants and the bistros and said, how stupid can the white man be to give us money? We will not get a job anyway later on. Let's enjoy these 4 years and so forth. It's also very, very difficult decisions. The other kind of talking about educational policies, the pressure of parents is very strong to say, do away with the humanities, foreign languages, and so forth, because one day the entire world will speak English anyway. Why do we need humanities and so forth? We are paying lots of money for education. We want education that provides our kids with jobs and not taking courses, I don't know, in American history, in English literature, or in other foreign language requirements and other things like this. So far, the universities has resisted against the other pressure. They want vocational school and not a university any longer because they're paying high fees. In this respect, I would say the United States is one of the most undemocratic countries in the world. And therefore, people who have money and so forth send their children to Ivy League or to other schools where they pay over $50,000 fees every year for undergraduates and so forth. And if you want to get a job, you have to go to these schools and so forth. Then all doors are open after 4 years. If you do your, let's say, master's or PhD, I don't know, Wyoming, Nebraska or so, where it's inexpensive to get a PhD, you can throw away the PhD because you won't get a job and so forth. There are many, many forces, I would say, that work against the optimism that this will change from the exclusive to the inclusive as a system in the long run. And because the United States is a very influential as a country and also influenced by introducing the bachelor system here and the master system and as many others, I also see a certain Americanization of German universities and also all the attempts now that students in certain states here in this country should pay fees and so forth, and not the kind of the public education they had before.
Are there other questions? So that we can collect questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I would like to return to the European situation, because otherwise we are opening a different chapter, I think. Because the study dealt with European countries. I don't know how many you covered at a very highly aggregated level, with a relatively simple model, I dare to say. Okay, with a relatively simple model, I dare to say, namely left-wing versus right-wing or inclusive versus exclusive. And you used all kinds of averages. and all criticism is all right going into details and specify with regard to levels, etc., etc. So that's very simple. But just looking at the results you had, I wondered, they were highly plausible. Each of them per se plausible. Now my question is, where are the surprises? The surprise effects you discovered in your studies when you tried to interlink the different countries in Europe at that highly aggregated level. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I don't think the difference, yes, there is so much of a difference, because both countries, Germany, for instance, and the United States, have both the problems with migration, whether here in Germany or about close to 12 million illegal immigration, as immigrants from Latin America and so forth. That is also changing the school system, of course. They also have the same problem that there are many children in schools who English is not their native language. This is the same problem you have here as in Berlin and so forth, as I heard, and so forth, which also reduces the other problem, which also makes it much harder. Why people then send the people with money send their children to other private schools? What I heard in this country and what I heard in the United States, I think this is a very similar kind of phenomenon.
Again, in the reverse order, you're perfectly right that is very simple or very simplistic. You know that economists are rough people. They just are content with the supply and the demand and an equilibrium if it does exist. What is the surprise? The surprise, according to my view, is that despite the educational attainment being an individual choice, which obviously, as an economist, I view as an investment decision according to the expected future return in the labor market. This is the view of the economist. This choice, which is an individual choice, respond to the environment which is designed by the educational authorities. And that people do respond not only to incentives but also to constraints, in my view, is an interesting result. I do agree that the results make sense, but some of them are less intuitive, like, for example, that providing school autonomy and accountability have a positive effect on the mean, but also an inequality-enhancing effect. That is not standard in the literature. Other results, like increasing compulsory education, were more standard. Going to your multiple questions, the final one about the pressure of parents for educational contents that provide jobs. This is true, but this is also related to the social stratification and the fact that the educational system do provide stratification. This is not my field of research. I don't know whether Professor Ann-Mendinger will want to say something about that. There are other reasons why people do demand education, like, for example, social exclusion. I want to enter a private university not because I know that the content of that education is higher than other university, but just because we become a member of the club. So you basically pay a high price in order to get the ticket, not because of the educational content. With respect to the ineffectiveness of student aid, this is also a result which has been found in most of the literature, that by providing financial aid, you basically don't change the destiny of people, except in some minorities. But on average, student support at college level is not very effective. So your perception is consistent. With respect to the private schools, this is another area of educational policies that we would have liked to cover. The point is, it's not easy to find information going back in the past about the private sector. Many countries do not publish a consistent time series of the size of the private sector, mostly for bureaucratic reasons, because the private sector do not report to the public administration just because they are private. And therefore, if we want to know, for example, in France in 1960, which was the share of students attending a private schools, you don't find the number, unless you go to national data sources, while we were trying to work at the aggregate level. We have this information using data on representative sample of students, like PISA. You know whether a student is attending a private or a public schools, but this goes back only 10 years. I've been working on the issue of private education, and I totally agree that at least in 1/4 of the countries, the competencies of students in the private sector are lower than the competence of students in the public one. And there is an issue of self-selection of students into the private. In some countries, typically the market-oriented one, like UK, US, the private sector is a selective device, and so it attracts the best students who are available to pay. Some other countries, like Italy or Japan, it is selecting the low-quality student from rich families. So they do attract lower quality students because it's basically providing a remedial education, which is less selective than the public sector.
Okay. Thank you very much. Are there more questions? Yeah. Please.
Okay. With your permission, I would like to put another question. Looking now at the whole of the European countries, did you try to make an analysis with regard to the regional differences? Northern European, Central European, Southern European. I think there might be some exciting differences to be mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me, because already Professor Menninger has raised the point and I didn't reply just because I forgot it. We tried to exploit this literature on variety of capitalism, according to which there is the coordinated economies, the market economies. But the different countries, despite what the gentleman was saying, change kind of educational policies. So if when they do change government, like for example the Labour period in UK or the Mitterrand period in France, they were performing different educational policies compared to other periods. So